Now, opponents of Scottish Government plans to introduce same-sex marriage have called on ministers to think again. Some critics, including several prominent SNP members, have questioned the legality of the proposals and claim they could hurt support for independence. The concerns were aired at an SNP conference fringe meeting on Thursday. Our reporter Andrew Black was there.
The Scottish Government may have decided to go ahead with a bill to introduce gay marriage, but opponents to the measure are clearly not giving up. They're more concerned than ever about what they see as the erosion of marriage, as this fringe meeting organised by the group Scotland for Marriage heard.
One of the things that the government has forgotten is, yes, they can come forward and analyse it and prove that A equals B, and it all adds up to the fact that the public are in favour of same-sex marriage. You can deceive yourself that way. But the electorate and those who put in these representations found that they did so in good faith. And what happened? It was ignored. And it's the fact that it was ignored that made the consultation process a fraud. And it's the fact it was ignored that rankles with many people. So you see, it's not been a fair fight, has it? And if they're not satisfied with that, they then use blackmail tactics. You're a bigot. You're a homophobe. You're bucking the liberal trends in society.
John Mason, who's a current MSP, questioned whether gay marriage, even if approved by Parliament, can work.
I personally remain to be convinced if Westminster is first of all able, and if Westminster is secondly willing to amend that Equality Act in order to provide that protection. And there is, of course, legal opinion as well that Westminster cannot provide that protection, and even legislation from Westminster would still leave churches and others subject to legal challenge.
Scotland's mainstream churches also oppose the measure. Whatever the legal concerns, John Deegan from the Catholic Church says gay marriage is just wrong.
We're all for equality and fairness and freedom, but those are balancing principles. You know, it becomes a tyranny if you make one principle crush every other principle.
Some 200 people attended the fringe meeting in Perth. Many spoke out against gay marriage, but not all.
Personally, I think as people who oppose this proposal, I don't like to see us opposing it even partly on the grounds that people are against it. I think we should oppose it very strongly on the grounds that it's simply wrong, and wrong remains wrong even if everybody says it, and right remains right even if nobody says it.
When all the political parties are all driving through same-sex marriage, despite the overwhelming number of people in the community that say they're opposed to it, you're actually disenfranchised then from voting from anyone.
I grew up in fear. The fear you were mentioning earlier. The fear because I'm a gay man. I grew up in fear of my job. The fear that I would be sacked. And I would have been. The fear that I wouldn't have been promoted. And now what we're looking for, in a society that has progressed over centuries, where in this country we have freedoms that others are bleeding for, minimal freedoms. What we're looking for is to progress that on the simple basis that an individual has the right to love a person and to settle with them in a contract recognised by the state.
Scottish ministers insist no churches would be forced to conduct same-sex ceremonies if they don't want to. And as the debate rages on, the SNP this weekend issued a warning for both sides to keep their language respectful.
Well, let's go back to the conference in Perth now, where Brian Taylor has some guests on the subject. Brian.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. Joined by John Mason, MSP, who chaired that fringe meeting, as we heard earlier, and Tom French from the Equality Act. Well, thanks both for joining us. John Mason, what fundamentally is your objection to same-sex marriage?
Well, I've said I'm not objecting per se to same-sex marriage, but I think my main concern is that the churches and people who do object should not be forced into taking part. And that's a genuine fear amongst the church and other religious communities, that they could be forced into doing that.
But haven't assurances been given that that will not be the case, not least by the First Minister?
Well, we've had assurances that they need help from Westminster to deliver that protection. But there is also legal advice that says that even Westminster cannot provide that protection, and that once we go to the European Court of Human Rights, that whole denominations could be challenged in the courts.
Tom French, what about that?
Well, I think the legal situation is clear. No religious body will be required to conduct same-sex marriages, but finally, those that want to, the Quakers, the Unitarians, the Liberal Jews, will be able to. So the legal situation there is clear, but this is a really historic policy for the SNP. They're finally providing full equality for LGBT people, same-sex couples in Scotland.
You say that there won't be challenges, but what is there to stop one couple perhaps seeking a test case, trying to get married in the Kirk or married in the Roman Catholic Church, just to force the issue and challenge the churches?
The law is there to stop that. So the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 9, is very clear on that. The Equality Act is very clear on the religious exemption already. And let's remember, no country around the world forces churches to conduct same-sex marriages, although almost every country surrounding Scotland already has same-sex marriage.
Some say there are civil partnerships already. Why do you need the sanction of marriage?
Well, the Equality Network always said when civil partnerships were being introduced that this is not equality. Setting up a separate legal institution, especially for gay people, is by its very nature not equality.
John Mason, how about that? It's not equal. It's simple equality demands that it be a marriage.
I mean, I want equality, and that can be done in different ways, and it's certainly primarily about rights. But I mean, I'm happy to accept that words are important, but I don't accept the assurance that there is no legal risk in this. The churches at the moment are protected for religious, like for services, priests, ministers, that kind of thing. But I mean, to some extent, this is about doing a public service, because marriage is partly in the public domain. And that's where it becomes risky for the churches, because if they're carrying out a public service, they could be at risk.
Gordon Wilson, who spoke at your Fringe meeting, has said in advance that he thought that this policy was neglecting public opinion and therefore was akin to fascism, driving through a change against the will of the people. Would you adopt that tone?
I don't like that tone, no, frankly. I mean, I think we can have this debate, and Tom and I hopefully today and at other times can have that debate in a reasonable way, using reasonable language, and lots of people are doing that. I mean, I think the reality is there's a minority really keen on this. There's, in my opinion, a bigger minority against it, but there's a majority of the public who don't have strong feelings on this.
Yeah. Would you prefer that the Scottish Government drop this policy?
I think they may not be able to take it forward, because if Westminster will not or cannot deliver, then they may not be able to do it.
Tom, it might not be possible to go ahead.
I don't think that's true. You know, 80 MSPs have already signed the Equality Network's Equal Marriage Pledge, saying that they will be voting for this. The government has said legislation is going to come forward this year, and we know that a majority of SNP members who have come up to our stall this weekend and a majority of the public, through the opinion polls, support this move. So I hope it will happen.
I know this is not your concern, but it has to be the concern of the SNP. All their minds are upon that referendum. Do you think this policy helps that case or damages that case?
Well, let's remember that people across all of the political parties, all of the party leaders, whether pro-independence or pro-union, support equality for same-sex couples. I don't think it's going to change anyone's votes, but let's also remember that 2/3 of the public support same-sex marriage. So if the government doesn't do this, that's going to have an effect.
John, it depends what question you ask the public, because you can also get a majority of the public who are against it. So it depends entirely how you word it. I still think the majority don't have strong views about it. I think there's a risk that the Parliament is out of touch with the public. The Parliament is more liberal, more secular than the public as a whole.
Tom, John, thanks both very much indeed. And with that, back to the studio.
OK, Brian, thank you very much. And Professor John Curtis is still with me here in the studio. John, do you think this could harm the independence argument? Do you think people out there might be put off by the Scottish Government's proposals for same-sex marriage?
Well, it's going to be very difficult to construct the argument, because it's not going to be the case that somebody's going to be able to point to the UK government and say, well, you know, the UK government is against same-sex marriage. Ergo, if we stayed in the Union, we wouldn't have this. Because the truth is there are already parallel moves being made by the UK government to change the law in England and Wales to introduce same-sex marriage south of the border as well. Now, there is a difference, and there's a difference which relates to what John Mason in particular is focusing about. At the moment, at least, the UK government for England and Wales is only proposing to introduce same-sex civil marriage, which would not allow the Quakers and others south of the border to hold ceremonies, although what the UK government has done is it does now allow Quakers and others to hold civil partnership ceremonies in religious premises, which was something that was previously outlawed. But so the particular issue of whether or not the churches are vulnerable as a result of the fact that the Scottish government is also proposing to allow religious organisations to conduct marriages, not just to be simply a civil ceremony. That particular aspect is different in Scotland, England and Wales. But broadly speaking, I think the truth is, if Scotland remains in the Union, same-sex marriage of some kind or another is going to be introduced anyway.